5 of the Pink Book and resume with Article 14. This is a petition article sponsored by town meeting member Brian Moss. Mr. Moss, would you please move the printed motion under Article 14? Is there a second?
Second.
The printed motion under Article 14 has been moved and seconded. Finance Committee recommendation?
The committee has recommended that this not pass.
Okay, Mr. Moss and his invited guest, Michael Dolan, have requested time to make a presentation on Article 14. Please note that the Shrewsbury Board of Health has prepared some informational materials which have been distributed to you, and the members of the Board of Health, Chair Dr. Maria Narducci, Jordan Rubin, Stephen Vigent, and Karen Clark of the Worcester Regional Health Department are here tonight, and Dr. Narducci is available after the presentation to answer any questions you may have of the Board of Health. Mr. Moss.
Okay, while that presentation is coming up, I want to thank you for the opportunity to come speak about Article 14 to ban water fluoridation in the town of Shrewsbury. Ending fluoridation is as easy as turning off the spigot at the local waterworks. But to turn off that spigot requires political will. Local resolutions represent grassroots democracy at its finest. They give ordinary citizens the opportunity to address important public health issues right in their own community. We'll discuss what is added to our water, what side effects are there, do we need to ingest it, and is it ethical? The town of Shrewsbury adds fluorosilicic acid to our public drinking water. It is categorized as a hazardous waste by the Environmental Protection Agency. Fluorosilicic acid is not naturally occurring. It is not the pharmaceutical grade quality used in dental products like toothpaste. It is an industrial waste byproduct from the phosphate fertilizer industry. The phosphate fertilizer industry takes phosphate rock and heats it up with sulfuric acid to make soluble phosphate for fertilizer. This process drives off two gases, hydrogen fluoride and silicon tetrafluoride. In the past, these two gases decimated vegetation in the areas of these fertilizer plants and crippled cattle. The cattle came down with skeletal fluorosis. Over time, they realized they should remove these toxic gases, so they put a wet scrubber in, and all that consisted of was a spray of water. And that spray of water converts these toxic gases into a solution called hexafluorosilicic acid. It contains all kinds of contaminants from the same phosphate rock that they treat to get this material. It contains lead, arsenic, and other toxic metals. The town of Shrewsbury is adding a chemical categorized as both a neurotoxin and endocrine disruptor. Fluoride is not an essential nutrient. No disease, not even tooth decay, is caused by a fluoride deficiency. Fluoride is categorized as a developmental neurotoxin alongside arsenic, lead, and mercury in the March 2014 journal, The Lancet Neurology. Fluoride is categorized as an endocrine disruptor by the National Research Council in 2006. And what's extremely disturbing is the level of fluoride in mother's breast milk is extremely low. It's 0.004 parts per million. That means that a bottle-fed baby in a fluoridated community in the United States, where the water is fluorinated at 1 parts per million, is getting 250 times higher dose of fluoride than a breastfed baby. Let's look at the side effects. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 41% of American children between the ages of 12 and 15 have dental fluorosis, which is the outward sign of overexposure to fluoride. You can see the graph as it went up over time. Dental fluorosis is a visible sign of toxicity. To give you a sense of what this negative side effect looks like, here are some photos showing white spotted, yellow, brown, and/or pitted teeth. Let's talk about how fluoride's benefits are achieved. Whatever benefit there is from fluoride on teeth is topical, not systematic, not when it is swallowed. According to the CDC in 1999, fluoride prevents dental caries predominantly after eruption of the tooth into the mouth, and its actions primarily are topical for both adults and children. Therefore, there is no need to swallow it and no need to add it to the water when the risks come from ingestion. 99% never even touches a tooth because most goes down the drain, doing laundry, showering, flushing the toilet. Makes more sense to use topical treatments such as toothpaste. According to the World Health Organization, there is no discernible difference in tooth decay between developed countries that fluorinate their water and those that do not. The decline in tooth decay in the U.S. has experienced over the last 60 years, which is often attributed to fluorinated water, has likewise occurred in all developed countries, most of which do not fluorinate their water. You can see both the downward decline of both. Fluoridation is an outdated form of mass medication. It's the only chemical added to treat you and not the water, to make a physical change in you. It's added to prevent a disease, tooth decay, but you can't control the dose because people drink different amounts of water, and you can't control who gets the treatment. The FDA has never approved fluoride for ingestion. The FDA rates fluoride as an unapproved drug, and fluoride has never undergone rigorous clinical trials for effectiveness by the FDA. It should be a freedom of choice, not a mandate. When communities fluoridate their water, they do to the whole community what an individual doctor is not allowed to do to anyone, prescribe medication without the individual's informed consent. Informed consent is a standard practice for all medication and one of the key reasons why most of Western Europe has ruled against fluoridation. With all the medicine, it is the patient and not the doctor who gets to choose. And when medicine is added to the water, that right is taken away. There are so many things wrong with fluoridation. First, it's unethical. You're forcing it on people that don't want it. That violates their informed consent. It's bad medical practice. You can't control the dose. You can't control who gets it. Most countries don't do it, and their tooth decay rates are just as good, if not better, than ours. There are many risks involved, and that chemical is not pharmaceutical grade. It's hazardous waste material. I'll leave you with a quote from Mahatma Gandhi. You must be the change you want to see in the world. So please stand with me in making that change you would like to see by voting yes on this article, calling upon the town of Shrewsbury to ban water fluoridation of its public water supply. And I'd like to invite Michael Dolan, who's a member of the faculty at UMass Amherst, to speak next on this topic.
Mr. Dolan.
Thank you. Mr. Moderator, my name is Michael F. Dolan. I live at 30 Sherwood Drive in Belchertown. I have a PhD in biology, and for the past 7 years, I've been accumulating the nation's largest archive of documents on the struggle over water fluoridation at the Du Bois Library at UMass, and I also teach at UMass. The struggle over fluoridation is very contentious and has been from the start, but there are two aspects of it which are not in dispute. The first is that by adding fluoride to the drinking water, we are causing dental fluorosis, as Mr. Moss showed you in the pictures. This is a damage to the teeth that is caused by the fluoride. So the chemical which we're adding to protect teeth is also damaging them. The founder of water fluoridation, H. Trenley Dean, referred to this dental fluorosis as a low-grade chronic fluorine poisoning of children. Now, much of the dental fluorosis is of what would be considered a very mild type, but there is, as with anything in nature, a distribution, a kind of a normal distribution, and there will be some people who have very severe forms of fluorosis. Dr. Dean predicted that only about 10% of children would develop dental fluorosis, and it would be all of this mild kind, or very mild. But that's not what happened. By the early 1980s, alarming reports were coming forward that 28% of children had dental fluorosis. And then 5 years ago, the Health and Human Services announced that the prevalence of dental fluorosis in 12 to 15-year-olds is 41%. So 41% of the young teenagers in this country show some visible signs of chronic fluoride poisoning. And of those, about 3.5% nationally, or about 5% in fluoridated communities, have moderate to severe fluorosis, which costs thousands of dollars to repair. The other thing that's not in dispute, and this is something that has been discovered in the last 20 years, as Mr. Moss mentioned, is that fluoride in drinking water is a neurotoxin. We don't know yet what the minimal amount of fluoride is needed to have this neurotoxic effect, but that fluoride is a neurotoxin is not in dispute. We've known this for 20 years since the research by Mullenix and others at the Forsyth Dental Center in Boston. Since that time, there have been dozens of studies of people drinking naturally fluoridated water in which it has been found that the children suffer a lower IQ on IQ tests as an indication of damage to their brains. And then a few years ago, the Harvard School of Public Health did a meta-analysis of all these human studies and concluded that this neurotoxic effect was real. Lastly, the Environmental Protection Agency's special neurotoxicity laboratory lists fluoride as a chemical with substantial evidence of neurotoxicity. I would respectfully suggest that we're currently in a situation now with fluoride that we were previously in with lead. You recall we added that to paint and to gasoline, and we were assured throughout the 60s and 70s that the amount of lead found in children's blood was not harming them. But subsequent studies have found that even minute amounts of lead in children's blood damages their brains. I would think that we should exercise precaution and assume that the same is going to be found with regard to fluoride. Now, you may be saying, why are these guys bringing this to the town meeting? Aren't there state and federal agencies that deal with this type of thing? Well, there are and there aren't. You may not know this, but about 6 years ago, both the American Dental Association and the Centers for Disease Control issued statements on their websites recommending to parents that they not use fluoridated tap water to reconstitute infant formula if they want to avoid this dental fluorosis. Well, I thought this was an interesting development, so I called the local Board of Health, this was in Amherst, to ask them if they were going to publicize this, and they said, no, we follow the direction of the State Department of Public Health. So I called the State Department of Public Health and asked them if they were going to publicize this, and they said, no, we follow the lead of the Centers for Disease Control. So I called the Centers for Disease Control and asked them if they were going to have a press conference or publicize this, and they said, no, it's up to the manufacturers of the infant formula to tell customers not to use the fluoridated tap water in reconstituting the infant formula. So, to a considerable extent, the state and federal governments are not exercising any responsibility for this program. It's almost as if it's on automatic pilot for the past several decades. There has been a recent recommendation that the amount in water be lowered to 0.7 from 1.0, but this is essentially replicating how the whole thing started, where a recommendation was made before it was studied. And so now this new recommendation still hasn't been studied. We've still been waiting now for 9 years for EPA to set a new maximum contaminant level for fluoride. So unfortunately, you may be sitting there saying, well, I don't want to deal with this either, but under state law, it's the town and city that has the right to decide whether you want this or not. And I would recommend that you vote yes on this article. It would just start the process. You could have full hearings and investigations of all aspects of this topic, and then have a referendum next year to decide if you want to continue it. I would also point out that the proponents of this policy like to suggest that there are experts up here, the medical experts up here, who know what they're talking about and who you should listen to, and then there are the uneducated people here who get junk science off the internet. That's not true. There are experts on both sides of this thing, which is what makes it complicated, because the dentists say it's safe and the neurotoxicologists say it's not safe. So I would salute Brian Moss for bringing this up. It's high time that it be reevaluated, and so I recommend you vote yes on the article. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions or comments with respect to Article 14? Yes, ma'am. Sorry, I can't see you back there.
Gallagher, precinct 6. I have a question. On your last slide, you wrote there are negative side effects on children. Those negative side effects, would that be the dental fluorosis?
Mr. Moss?
Or are there others that you're talking of?
Yes, on the last slide, I mentioned that children are being overexposed and have experienced negative side effects. So the outward sign of those negative side effects are dental fluorosis. That's where the CDC is saying that 41% of the children. And Michael Dolan has explained that there are other systematic effects, such as neurotoxicity effects. Yes.
Would that be the thing that's quoted in here from the Chinese studies? Or is there something it talks about in the article on IQ and other neurological effects?
Yes.
Several Chinese studies considered this. Is that
Yes.
what they're
So
quoting them
yeah,
from?
they have found there's been recent findings on lower IQ, links to ADHD, and hypothyroidism.
Thank you.
Further questions or comments? Ms. Byrne?
Melissa Byrne, Precinct 6. I actually have a question for the town manager and just want to know if the levels of fluoride that have been in the water since I've lived in this town since 1967 have been the same or have changed. I know you said something about 4 parts per million or something like that.
Mr. Morgado.
Mr. Tezeski can talk about that.
Water and Sewer Superintendent Bob Tezeski is in need of a microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Shrewsbury has been fluoridated water since 1953, and basically we've been at 1 part per million. The CDC and other standards, if you see, it's somewhat different. It goes from 0.7 to 1.2, basically because it's determined on the average mean temperature over a 5-year period. In other words, where you have warmer weather, you would consume more water. So some parts of the country are using the 0.7, 0.8. Others were using up to the 0.1, 0.2. We in New England have used the 1.0 basically since 1953 to present.
Further questions or comments? Mrs. McLaughlin. Helen, you did a good job of not waving the mic while you spoke on Monday night. Let's keep it going.
I would try very hard. Helen McLaughlin, Precinct 10. A question, have there been studies done on the population, the school-age population, so there are concrete facts regarding the Shrewsbury students? Is there any published information? That's what I'm asking. If you've been fluoride.
Response, Dr. Narducci?
Not that I'm aware of. Most of the studies that Mr. Moss was referring to, in particular the IQ study, the meta-analysis out of Harvard, was a meta-analysis means they look at all the studies that are done and they put them together and then they try to make conclusions from that. In that meta-analysis, they looked at 27 different studies about fluoride. 25 of those studies were out of China and 2 of them were out of Iran. And the fluoridation in the water in China is much higher than what we have here. And so it's really hard to draw conclusions about what's happening to IQ at the level of fluoridation that we're doing in this country. But there's no studies that I'm aware of that looks just at the Shrewsbury kids. Those studies are very hard to do because you would have to follow a whole population of pregnant women, look at their kids, try to make sure that everything between that population is exactly the same except for the fluoride. So their ages, the gender of the kids, what food they're eating, what shampoo they're using, all that stuff has to be the same. And then in a perfect world, the only difference would be whether they got fluoride or whether they didn't. And neither group could know who was getting it and who wasn't. That's a sort of a description of a double-blinded, prospective, randomized study. And those are technically hard to do. They're costly, and the feasibility, it's just hard to do those things. And so, no, that's not done for Shrewsbury, and it's actually not done for many, many, many things, just because the feasibility it's hard. Does that help?
Do you have a follow-up, Mrs. McLaughlin?
Through the moderator. So it is an assumption then that the facts indicate that fluoridation is bad for people?
I think on Monday night you guys got a lot of information. I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but to me the best article in there was the third article, which was from the U.S. Public Health Services. That's sort of hot off the press. It's due to come out in their July-August report. And what they were looking at was trying to figure out how could they lower the rates of the fluorosis. So they were looking at sort of what's the minimal amount of fluoride that can protect against tooth decay, but limit the fluorosis. They were also looking at climate to try to figure out if kids in hotter climates drink more tap water, and so should the recommendations for that population be different. And part of that process, they had a period for public comment, so that people that were aware that this research was going on could make comments, and they got about 18,000 comments from people. Most of those, over 17,000 of those, were a form letter, like you would send to your senator, sort of click an email and it goes. But 700 or so were sort of individuals, people's responses with their own experiences, their own concerns. And so the people that were doing that research, which was a bunch of scientists from the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Agriculture, the Center for Disease Control, a bunch of those scientists broke down all those individual comments and tried to figure out what people's concerns were. They talked about concerns for risk of cancer, specifically osteosarcoma being related to fluoride. They talked about risk of IQ changes and other neurotoxic things, ADHD, other endocrine things like hypothyroidism. And they looked at each one of those things, and then they looked at all the research that's been available through the years. And they concluded that there's no clear evidence that fluoride is not safe. So on every one of those things, they were comfortable that fluoride is safe and has had no adverse health effects. And so I think where we are today is that every major healthcare organization in the country, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Dental Association, the Center for Disease Control, every organization, Mass Dental Society, all the state dental societies, is on board that fluoride is safe. And tooth decay in kids is the most common chronic illness of kids. And so I didn't have a chance to sort of say the Board of Health opposes Article 14, but I guess I would conclude with that. So I hope that helps.
Further questions or comments with respect to Article 14? Ma'am, behind Mr. Lukács.
Susan White, Precinct 1. Regarding fluoridation in water, when we have water filtration systems through refrigerators or any other means, does that block a good percentage of the fluoride? Number one. And number two, because a lot of kids are drinking bottled water, how much do they have to consume to have any effect? Do we know?
Response, Mr. Moss?
So I can respond to the first one. That the carbon-based filters that you find in your refrigerator do not filter out fluoride. You would need a more expensive system. I think reverse osmosis is the type that you would need, but no, not the Brita filters and stuff don't filter it out.
Dr. Narducci, did you have a response to that question?
The second question was that
repeat that,
water.
Mrs. White?
Bottled water doesn't typically have fluoride added to it, and so. Right, there's not great studies on quantity and exposure. In other words, how much do you drink? How much do I drink? What's our concentration? There's not great studies on that. What one of the articles talked about sort of where your fluoride comes from, and a percentage of it comes from tap water, but I think only 25% was the number I read. And then some of it comes from other sources, right? Your toothpaste, your rinses, fluoride washes that the dentist does. And so by the U.S. Public Health Service, by cutting their range down to the 0.7, they're trying to restrict how much you get through your tap water, but they're not making any restrictions on your brushing and your, and I think that they say 20% of the fluoride exposure in kids is from swallowing toothpaste. So that's sort of, that's 20% is a big chunk of your exposure.
Mr. Lukács.
John Lukács, Precinct 2. I think it's generally well known that too much of almost anything can be harmful. And so the question is how much is enough to do good without doing harm? And just to follow up on something that was just said earlier, there are many possible causes of dental fluorosis. So unless you can show studies that control for all those other variables, you haven't made a case that fluoride in the concentrations we currently have are harmful to children. So if we wanted to do that, we would have to, the people who want to eliminate fluoride would have to put together meta-studies, similar to what was just discussed, showing over a period of time for a fixed population exactly, and controlling for as many of the other variables as possible to make sure that those other variables aren't the primary factors in causing fluorosis or low IQ or any of the other things that you're attributing to fluoride. So that's pretty much standard in science. You have to look at all those variables and control for the significant variables before you make a conclusion like that. I would also say that it's a cost-benefit analysis too. Some people say, well, a lot of kids can drink tap water. Well, yeah, they can, but there are a lot of kids, let's say, whose parents don't, give them bottled water. Those kids need the fluoride. And then I would make one other point. Somebody also mentioned 20% comes from swallowing toothpaste, as opposed to, maybe 20% comes from fluoride from bottled water. I actually think it's higher in the case of swallowing. I know young kids, I know my kids anyway, they tend to swallow a significant portion of the toothpaste. And if your kids were brushing twice a day and they drank a normal amount of water, I did a rough back of the envelope calculation. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but if you look at those percentages of what the concentration of fluoride in toothpaste as opposed to the concentration of water, and then factor in how much of that goes in and how many grams of each of toothpaste versus how many milligrams per liter of water, you can do the comparison. I think you're going to find it's certainly 5 to 10 times more just by young kids ingesting fluoride. So I'm opposed to this article currently. I think having hearings, if you want to have hearings, you should have hearings before the Board of Health, and we can talk about this more. And if you have more evidence that you can provide to people before we come to a town meeting like this, then I'd be happy to look at that evidence. But until that time, I think this article should be defeated. Thank you.
Further questions or comments? Yes, ma'am? Is that Mrs. Powers? No, can't see you that well. Sorry.
Nancy Nelson, Precinct 10. I just wanted to get some clarification around if we voted for or against this, what exactly would happen next. I'm assuming they're not going to just go down and switch the fluoride off if we vote yes. Is this I heard a referendum question mentioned. What would the next steps be?
Mr. Moss, I'm going to give you the first crack at that, or Mr. Dolan.
The state law that kind of serves as the referee for this process doesn't specify a mechanism for ending it. Used to be you could just have a referendum and end it. But what has happened in the case law, which I think started in New Bedford around 1980, is that if the town meeting were to vote to end fluoridation, the town would then have to ask the local state legislators to have them obtain a special law from the state legislature allowing you to have a referendum. And this is what Rockport recently did. The town meeting voted to end it. They obtained the state law and had the referendum the last couple weeks ago. And
Mr. Morgado, any response?
Yes, my response is that there are no provisions. It's something that we would have to, the Board of Selectmen it acts as the town's water commissioners, Board of Water Commissioners. They would have to then consult the Board of Health and see how the Board of Health wants to proceed. But there is no mechanism in place to take this to referendum. That mechanism just doesn't exist. It could be created through formal petition, but it currently doesn't exist. So I think, to answer your question, I think the gentleman, was somewhat correct, but just not entirely.
Dr. McGee.
Thank you. Dale McGee, Precinct 5. I think I have a couple things that I'd like to say. First of all, we're hearing conflicting information that is based on science this evening, and I just want to make the point that that's nothing that unusual. 40 years of reading the medical literature every day, I'm exposed to conflicting opinions. The medical literature, the scientific literature, is really a conversation between researchers or among researchers. And one will say, this is what I think, and another will say, no, this is what I think. And it goes on. And if you try to do your research and you read what is published, depending on when you tune in and how the breadth of your research, you may get one or another opinion. Whenever I run into conflicts like that, I try to expand the breadth of my research. I try to consult other people who are expert in the field, get their opinions, and try to see what they think is right. And this is especially true if someone is recommending that I change something that I'm doing already. I need somebody to convince me, to show me what I'm missing from all the evidence that has been there. And it's important for people to realize that fluoridation of water is considered one of the top 10 success stories of public health in the United States over the 20th century. And that it is recommended by the American Dental Association, as Dr. Narducci said, numerous medical associations, our own Board of Health, which has no particular axe to grind on this, and the World Health Organization, which is trying to fluoridate water around the world where it is needed. So even though there was a slide up there saying otherwise, one of the priorities of the World Health Organization is to fluoridate waters in communities where the levels are lower. Caries, dental decay is a common problem, and we've had the advantage of fluoride in this community for a long time. So we may take for granted the fact that all of the success makes the fluoride unnecessary. This isn't so. Teenagers, by the time they reach 18, have a 70 to 90% incidence of cavities. And by adding fluoride to the water, we cut that down by a substantial amount. They are healthier, their whole bodies are healthier because of this, not just their teeth. And we do it in a cost-effective way. Even though most of it is going down the drain, the fact of the matter is it's dirt cheap. So that for the 70 cents per person per year that we're spending, the payback in saved dental expenses per person in this community is estimated to be about $25 a year. So the community spending 75 cents, you're benefiting individually by about $25 a year in lower dental costs. So that's a good thing that is happening here. And I just want people to recognize that. I think the last thing is that although you can have other ways of getting the fluoride, the fact is that when we eliminate fluoride from the water and we tell people to go to the dentist and get their treatments, even people who want to, even people who have the insurance for it, don't make it half the time. And so if you eliminate fluoride from the water, you can be pretty sure the incidence of caries is going to go up. I think that we have a significant question here. It's worth pausing every now and then and saying, should we still be doing this? I think that's a reasonable thing to do. The fact is that they're going to lower the level of fluoride in Shrewsbury by 30%, and that this is the result of research that was published just last month, and our own Board of Health is meeting on it, and with no drama or anything, they're going to just lower it down because they want to do what's best for this community. And so I feel that we've delegated this to a good Board of Health. They've got the time, they're doing the research, they're getting the expert opinion, and I trust their judgment. I'm against this resolution.
Further questions or comments? Mr. Gordon.
Melvin Gordon, Precinct 3. I'd like to move the question.
Okay, the previous question has been moved. I do want to call your attention to the fact that there are many hands still up in the auditorium at the time you move the question, Mr. Gordon, but I can't force you to withdraw the motion, but I just want to make that note. A motion for the previous question has been made and seconded. This is a motion to end debate on the article before us. This motion is not debatable and must be voted on immediately. Just to recap, a vote in favor of the motion is a vote to end discussion of this article and proceed to an immediate vote on the motion under Article 14. A no vote is a vote to continue the discussion of Article 14, and this motion requires a majority vote to pass. Would all those in favor of the motion to end debate on this article please signify by saying aye? Aye. All those opposed to the motion to end debate, please signify by saying no. No. And the motion passes. We will now proceed to an immediate vote on the motion under Article 14. This motion requires a majority vote to pass. Will all those in favor of the printed motion under Article 14 please signify by saying aye? All those opposed, please signify by saying no. No. And the motion is defeated. Article 15.
I move
Mrs.
the
Miller?
printed